Today, we spotlight the remarkable work of researchers from Western Sydney University who are contributing to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Western is proud to be ranked number 1 globally in the Times Higher Education University Impact Rankings for Sustainability, a distinction we have held for 4 consecutive years. This series is part of our Sustainability and Resilience Decadal Strategy 2030, showcasing research that drives real-world change. Today's event is Native Insect Crop-Pollinator Diversity, and it addresses a critical issue facing Australian agriculture, the future of pollination in the wake of the Varroa mites spread. As many of you know, around 75% of Australian crops benefit from insect pollination, with honeybees playing a central role. However, the recent establishment of Varroa destructor in Australia has raised serious concerns about the reliability of honeybee pollination. This has prompted researchers and farmers alike to explore alternative pollination strategies, including the potential of our native insect species. We are honored to welcome 2 distinguished speakers from Western Sydney University who are at the forefront of this research. Dr. Amy-Marie Gilpin and Professor James Cook. Dr. Amy-Marie Gilpin is a lecturer in invertebrate ecology in the School of Science and the founder and head of the Ecological Interactions Research Team. Their work focuses on the complex relationships between plants and their pollinators and how these systems respond to environmental disturbances such as fire and invasive species. Dr. Gilpin has led fieldwork investigating native insect pollinators in apple orchards across Gilpin and Orange, helping us better understand their role in crop production. Professor James Cook is a professor of entomology at the Hawkesbury Institute for Environment. With a lifelong passion for natural history and a career spanning the UK, Kenya, and Australia, Professor Cook's research centers on the interactions between plants and insect pollinators. Their current work focuses on the pollination services provided by native bees and flies, particularly in orchards and protected cropping environments. Dr. Gilpin and Professor Cook will share their insights into how native insects might help secure the future of pollination in Australia, a topic that is not only scientifically fascinating, but also deeply relevant to food security and environmental sustainability. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy-Marie Gilpin and Professor James Cook. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Petra, for the introduction. I want to start by saying that Australia has flowering plant species that are highly diverse and unique. Equally so, in diversity and uniqueness, are the pollinators that visit these flowering plant species and that are pollinated by these pollinators. Plant-pollinator interactions are also highly understudied in Australia, which is absolutely fantastic news for a plant-pollinator ecologist. And what's really amazing, in my opinion, is that this unique interrelationship between the flowering plants and the pollinators in Australia has given rise to amazing ecosystems and that are found nowhere else on Earth. These systems are like the heathlands found in the Blue Mountains. We're here at Hawkesbury at the moment, so these are literally on our doorstep and they're in full bloom at the moment. So if you haven't checked them out, please go up and have a look. They're just absolutely fantastic. You might also catch a glimpse of these little native bees that are up there at the moment as well and active. It also includes places like the arid zone, whose flowers are dependent on ephemeral rainfall and are inextricably linked to that vital resource. Ecosystems such as the alpine heaths that are, harsh environments, harsh in terms for, humans, but also for the plants that inhabit them and the pollinators that visit them. And there are huge diversity of pollinators that visit these alpine meadows. Our research team also looks at grassy woodlands like these down in Victoria, salt marsh ecosystems, which are endangered ecological communities, not just where Shrek lives, but where, fascinating plants have adapted very unique pollination systems, like that seen in samphire or sarcocornia, which heavily relies on water for pollination. Our research also takes us to places like the mangroves, where these are also endangered ecological communities, and very little is known about the pollinators that visit them. So what else do these places all have in common? They're unique, they're diverse, they're understudied, but they're also under threat. And they're under threat from anthropogenic change. Things like land clearing for urbanization, but also for agriculture. This disrupts the natural balance between native plants and their pollinators. Agriculture also can mean the introduction of new plant species that flower en masse. And this can obviously be problematic for pollinators that inhabit this area, but also the native plant species that are remnant within these locations and that rely upon native pollinators. Bushfire is another big one. With climate change set to increase the frequency and severity of fires in Australia, this will pose a huge problem for plant pollinator systems. Obviously, there are direct impacts when plants are consumed by the fire and pollinators are obviously impacted, but there's also indirect effects. And that's some of the questions that our research lab are answering in terms of the longer term impacts on flowering cycles. But it's not just natural systems that are affected by fire. And places like our agricultural areas in the 2019-2020 bushfires were severely impacted by bushfire. The natural native vegetation that surrounds these areas was consumed by those fires. And in turn, the pollinators that naturally occur within those native remnants were impacted. This then has huge flow-on effects for yield and crop production. Another aspect of disturbance is the impact of invasive species. And most of us are obviously joining from Australia, so we're well aware that Australia has huge problems with invasive species. And we can all recognise the impacts that these animals and plants have on ecosystems. But what is quite unusual then is the fact that one of these invasive species really flies under the radar. And this really is the public exception to our understanding of invasive species. And this is the European honeybee. It is an invasive species in Australia, and indeed in New South Wales, it's actually under the New South Wales legislation listed as a key threatening process. We also have some of the highest densities of feral honeybees in the entire world, mainly because it's quite mild, our temperature. The bees like it, although today's maybe not so mild. It's pretty hot here. But we also have a plethora of fantastic floral resources for them. So fantastic bee food, eucalypts, banksias, all those kind of great things provide essential nectar and pollen resources for honeybees, so their populations can flourish. We also have great hollow-bearing trees like eucalypts, where they obviously can then nest. And this is a big problem. I think, and this is something that I'm very passionate about, is trying to get awareness out there about the impact of feral honeybees on natural systems. And I believe that some of this misinformation really boils down to the fact that we have campaigns like Save the Bee campaigns that are originating in the Northern Hemisphere where these honeybees are from and native. But we also have Australian foundations that can muddy the waters, and it's difficult for the general public then to understand the vital role the honeybees play within our agriculture, but perhaps the very detrimental role that they can play within our natural ecosystems. And the problem really arises because of the sheer number of honeybees in the Australian environment. In all of those ecosystems that I've just shown you in the beginning of this talk, they've all been successfully invaded by European honeybees. And European honeybees can obviously have huge impacts on the native plant reproduction. Like you could see here, we have an invasive honeybee on Baronia ledifolia in the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area. But they can also impact native pollinators because they're actually taking resources out of the Australian environment that otherwise would have been freed up for native pollinators. And these are some of the issues that the Ecological Interactions research team are primarily concerned about. Our work really focuses on understanding plant-pollinator interactions in native systems, but also agricultural areas, looking at co-flowering plant interactions. We have aspects that look at uncovering and discovering the hidden world of ground nesting bees, looking at their behavior and their ecology. Some of our research focuses on understanding the impacts of climate change, specifically bushfires, and how they can impact plant-pollinator interactions. And other aspects are really focusing on invasive species, and particularly the European honeybee, both in terms of managed pollinators and how they're impacting native plant-pollinator interactions, but also how feral populations that are occurring within national parks are impacting plants and pollinators. Something that most people may not know is that apiaries, so places where managed hives are allowed, they're actually allowed in national parks in New South Wales, despite legislation that feral honeybees are a key threatening process. And this is a map showing where all the apiary sites are within National Park Estate in New South Wales. Here's another picture of honeybees in national parks down the south coast. Each one of these designated apiary sites is actually allowed up to 200 hives. And if you can imagine 200 hives coming in, that means there's a really big sudden influx of pollinators into conservation areas. This can obviously have huge impacts on plants, but also on the pollinators that rely upon the resources within these areas. When I first found this out, I decided to write a conversation article back in 2023, really, highlighting some of these problems with us not identifying and, trying to remove feral honeybees from natural areas. More recently, with the Varroa mite incursion and the establishment of Varroa mite in Australia, some co-authors from UNSW and myself wrote a paper that was published in Australian Journal of Botany this year, really looking at the impact that the mite can have on feral honeybee populations, because they're set to decline if we follow suit from elsewhere around the world. And this can obviously have huge impacts on Australian plants and their persistence. So that's something that paper explores. But we need more empirical evidence. And that's the job of Rose Harper, who's here in the audience today. Rose was an MRes student within our lab and now a PhD student. And her main focus is looking at managed honeybees and their impact within national parks on native plant pollinator networks. So Rose has some really hard field work in some pretty awful places, actually. I really feel for Rose. But she's busy most days out in the field on the south coast, looking at sites and trying to determine the impacts of managed apiaries on heathlands that are closely located to these apiary sites and more distantly located. I also want to highlight some of the research by our PhD student, Andrew Williamson, who was also an MRes student previously. His work really focuses on understanding the effects of bushfire. And it's really important work because a lot of our ecosystems are actually dominated by eucalypts. And it might come as a bit of a surprise, but we don't know how fire severity and frequency impacts the flowering cycles of these dominant eucalypt species. And so that is something that Andrew's research is really focusing in on. He's also looking at recolonization of native bees after fire. And so he has been very busy as a bee, making bee hotels and placing them out in national parks in and around Sydney to look at recolonization after fire. Like I said before, that a lot of these systems are highly understudied. And it might come as a bit of a surprise to some of you that the vast majority of native bees are actually ground nesting and they're solitary. And so this is some work by Kavya Chaitramsini, who's just handed in her master's. Congratulations, Kavya. And she's working on this very charismatic bee, Lipotrichis muscosa, which is located here on the Hawkesbury campus. And she's really asking a very fundamental question that we just don't know about, which is, what do they eat? And this is some metabarcoding data that she's got. And from this, you can see that they basically eat the rainbow, but each one of these colors actually corresponds to a different flowering plant species. We're also looking at the ground nesting bee, Leoproctus fulvus, and this is some work by Matthew Cunningham, who's undertaking his master's at the moment. He wanted to look at the hidden world underground of these creatures and look at the nest architecture. So he made a forge. He dug out the cast that he'd created. And from this, he was able to look at and develop the nest architecture of what these nests actually look like underground. Something that I'm personally very passionate about is understanding the pollination system of threatened species. And this was some work done by Laura Lopresti, an honours student of mine, where she was looking at the pollination of Zaire granulata, the Illawarra Zaire. And this is a fascinating mural that was made last week in Kiama, celebrating the fantastic Zaire. And Laura's work is the only publication that actually explores the pollination system of this amazing plant. And I'm so glad to see it celebrated in such a nice way in the heart of Kiama. What I think we have here is a real opportunity for Australian plant pollinator systems, because through this research that our lab and others at Western Sydney Uni are doing, we're actually building an understanding. This understanding can build targeted conservation efforts, which can lead to increase in diversity and abundance of pollinators within both our natural systems, but also our agricultural systems. And this is very important if we're going to think about things like yield and the sustainability and resilience of our ecosystems into the future. And I think that's a great segue into Professor James Cook's talk, which is up next.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you everybody for joining us here for this talk today. Like Amy, I'm very widely interested in plant-pollinator interactions within the natural world, but also within agroecosystems. So Amy has given you a lot of information about the Australian context of pollination and particularly around impacts on the natural systems. I'm going to concentrate a little bit more on our work and the issues in terms of insects and crop pollination in Australia. So to start off, the key context really is what crops actually need insect pollinators. And it's a pretty simple answer that it's really most of them. So 80% or so of crops require pollination by animals, and it's nearly always insects. I'll say a bit more about that on the next slide, but essentially insect pollination is the key. So which crops are these? Well, it's basically all of your fruits and veggies. So essentially all fruits obviously require pollination to turn a flower into a fruit. And in terms of the crops that we actually eat, they're virtually all pollinated by insects. And this includes both obvious fruits like mangoes and melons and so on, cherries, but also things we typically think of as vegetables like tomatoes or capsicums, but technically, botanically, these are fruits too. They're produced from the flowers. And although there are then other important vegetables, so think of root vegetables, for example, and your leafy greens, so the bits we eat are not the direct product of pollination, but we still require the services of insect pollinators. So a fairly big sector in Australian agriculture and elsewhere is, for example, the production of seed for carrots and onions and things like this. And obviously the seeds come from pollinated flowers. So again, we require the services of pollinators. So most of the good stuff that you eat and that the doctor will tell you to eat, your 5 or 7 a day, does come from the work of insect pollinators, but also some of the real pleasures outside of that, like chocolate and coffee. So chocolate from cocoa pods and coffee from coffee bushes, again, requires the actions of insect pollinators. So at this point, you're probably thinking everything relies on insect pollinators. And as a pollination ecologist, I'm happy for you to think that, really. But it's not quite true, because there is a large group of food items, which are your staple carbs, mostly derived from grasses, so your grains and cereals, which are largely wind pollinated. So there are categories of food which are not directly heavily reliant on insect pollinators, but there's a very large selection of key things that are. So which insects pollinate your crops? Well, we've already heard a lot about honeybees, probably the best known insect in this category, and clearly they're very important. There are lots and lots of other bees, 20,000 species in the world, probably around 2,000 in Australia. They're a very important group because they're very much tied in their own life cycles to harvesting pollen and nectar. Flies are also a very large and important group, along with moths and butterflies. And then other relatives of bees, like the wasps, plus also beetles, and then various other insects. So even some tiny insects like thrips, which some of them are pests, but many of them are also important pollinators. And on the right of the slide you've got here is a diagram I've taken from a study by Fabrice Requier and colleagues. And they did a bit of a global survey of which animals were important in crop pollination, both locally and globally. So if you look at the bottom of the graph, the really big impact is bees. So bees are the number one insect pollinators, and the red bar is showing local importance, the blue bar global importance. So bees, very important. Above that, Diptera, that's flies, Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies, Coleoptera, beetles. So insects rule. At the top, you'll see that birds and bats also play roles, and they have larger bars in red than in blue. So there are some certain local crops where they can be really important, but most of this work is really done by insects. So if we put the insects and the crops together now, and think about how the services are delivered. So some crops are only grown in a few places. And a good example here is macadamia nut, which is endemic to Australia. It's actually the only major crop, if you even think it is a major crop, that is of Australian origin. But it's grown in Australia, South Africa, Kenya, China, and that's pretty much it. But then there are lots of other crops which are grown pretty much everywhere across the world. And apples will be a great example of this, grown throughout all the continents, essentially. And they're obviously pollinated in general by bees, but which bees depends a lot on where you are. And I'll go into this a bit more. And the picture on the bottom left is a little stingless bee from our Gilpin Blue Mountains apple orchards. And this is a feature of our local orchards, but you'll find this group of insects pollinating apples pretty much nowhere else. So an interesting topic that comes up is that sometimes crops are grown outside where they naturally evolved, and there may be issues with them missing their normal pollinators. And this is even more of an issue if we then take them into protected cropping. Now, this is one of my favorite diagrams ever, I think. It's one produced by the Centre for International Tropical Agriculture, and it shows the origins and main areas of diversity of major crops around the world. So don't worry about the details of it. It's a big map of the world with lots of little icons of nice things we eat directed at different places. So there are some areas which are really important. So in a lot of areas around the Mediterranean, for example, areas within Asia and within the Americas. And then there's Australia. And the big feature about Australia is it's basically blank on this. So there is no major global crop that originated in Australia. The only one that we might claim is macadamia, and there are some beautiful macadamia flowering racines on the right of the picture. And that has spread to a few places, as mentioned, but essentially all the major crops originated outside of Australia. And yet we grow lots of these things that originated often in the northern hemisphere for our temperate crops and in other parts of the tropics for our warmer area crops. So I'll just give you a couple of case studies, one temperate crop and one more tropical crop from an Australian context. So as Amy mentioned, we've been studying the apple and cherry crops for some time in the Blue Mountains and the Central West in the area around Orange. So work led by Simon Tierney and also by Amy. We've looked over several years at what insects visit the crops in apple orchards in this area. So we've got a couple of little pie charts here, and overall there are two major insect groups. The honeybees, by far the dominant ones, and there's a honeybee visiting the apple flower. It's got a bit of green powder on its back there, and that's actually from a mark and release capture study that Simon led, where we were trying to estimate how many wild bees and how many bees from hives were visiting the flowers. On the left of that picture, towards the bottom, there's a little stingless bee alongside. And what we found in the Blue Mountains was that the stingless bees and the honeybees between them made up almost all the pollinator visits to apple flowers. And their relative proportions varied across years, but really those two were dominant, with a few other insects, particularly a few other native flies and native bees playing a bit of a role. In the Central West, it was even more dominated by honeybees. So the little pie charts on the right, they're almost all yellow, and that's the European honeybee. And actually, if you look in other apple growing areas around Australia, European honeybees are providing, on average, something like 95% of the visits. So here we're very reliant on these introduced honeybees for pollinating this introduced crop, both from the Northern Hemisphere. Now we get a really different study. It is really a different study. We get a really different picture if we look at the pollination of mangoes in Darwin in the Northern Territory. So this is work by our former PhD student Gaurav Singh and other team members like James Makinson, and looking at half a dozen mango orchards just outside of Darwin. And what we find here is that the pollination of the mangoes is almost totally driven by native bees and native flies. Less than 1% of all visits was by honeybees. So you can basically forget honeybees in this system. So these were, again, stingless bees, but a different species of stingless bee, one that we don't get down here in the south. And the hoverflies were mostly hoverflies that were breeding in freshwater areas around here. And it's a really interesting landscape context here, because in this area, the mango orchards are essentially carved out of the surrounding woodland. So the aerial photograph that you can see here has the mango orchards with their nice serried rows next to a chunk of natural woodland savanna here. And what we found was that the stingless bees were actually virtually all coming from nests which were in the bordering woodland, particularly in trees that had been hollowed out by termites, and they would nest in the cavities of those trees and then penetrate into the crop from the remaining wild vegetation. And a really interesting pattern is that when we took samples right at the edge and 50 meters, 100 meters, and further into this block of mango trees, you find loads of stingless bees just around the edge, close to where their hives are. Sorry, not hives, but actual wild colonies. And as you move in, their visitation rate really drops off. Towards the middle of the block, what we find is much more of the pollination is down to flies. So the flies, both hoverflies and actually blowflies as well, were fairly evenly distributed throughout that. And that's because they don't have nests to go back to. They more wander around through the landscape. So here we've got two different groups of native insects, both playing important and complementary roles. So moving on, the culprit of the moment is the Varroa mite. And even this morning, there's another report out on the increasing effects of Varroa mite on honeybee keepers in New South Wales. So this is a global parasite, and it only attacks honeybees. So it's a really, really specific parasite. It doesn't attack other native bees. It only attacks honeybees. It's important through its direct effects. You can see the picture there. This is an animal a bit like a tick, but if you imagine a tick that size relative to the host, it's like having a tick on yourself that's the size of a large crab. So really a nasty direct effect, and they can directly kill the immature stages of honeybees and also affect the adult stages. But they also carry diseases like viruses. And this has been spreading around the world since about the 1950s. And every time it gets introduced to an area and spreads, wild honeybee populations collapse. It's hard for beekeepers to manage, and it's a real problem for wild populations. And as Amy mentioned, wild honeybee populations are now collapsing across New South Wales, and this is going to happen as it spreads to other states. It's already in Victoria, South Australia, and Queensland, but only in fairly few areas so far. It's going to get worse. Other recent things in the news you may have seen have mentioned a really poor fruit set in Gilpin in the Blue Mountains, so really bad apple fruit set. Various things might contribute to this, but a certain one is the collapse of these wild honeybee populations. And this is only going to get worse in the near future. And it's bad for apples, but clearly there are other insects that can contribute. But almonds, which are a huge economic crop in parts of Australia and elsewhere, are totally reliant on managed honeybees. So almonds actually flower in late winter in places where it's really cold. So most of the wild bees have not started their free-flying life cycle at that time of year. And the landscapes tend to be very heavily managed. You can see here part of an orchard where there's basically no vegetation here. So the way that honeybees are used is to bring in loads and like tens of thousands of honeybee hives, which are brought in and they pollinate the almonds. This is not what happens with almonds if you go to the Indian subcontinent, where you see like a rich fauna of different wild bees contributing. But this is the way we have to do it here. And this is the problem because the supply of honeybee hives is already taxed and it's going down. So you need masses and masses for a short period. And this year, for example, they were having to bring honeybee hives from West Australia, which then couldn't go back because of the risk of Varroa. So another challenge is the rise of protected cropping. This is keeping crops indoors where it's great in terms of managing them for crop growth, fertilization, pest control. But if you stick them in a great big glass house or a big structure, you're excluding the pollinating insects. So you then have to actively manage the pollinators. And we're doing work here in a really big glass house, almost 2-hectare one, which is the National Vegetable Protected Cropping Centre. And we've worked particularly with hydroponic strawberries, which are, again, a growing part of the sector, although tomatoes are the overwhelming crop in this sector at the moment. And we've done work with experiments with native bees and flies and various bagging experiments where you can allow access of different insects or different numbers of visits and compare that with either hand pollination or passive pollination. And the insects that we're focusing on, the highlight really is stingless bees, which I've mentioned already and will mention again. But we're also looking at flies, so hover flies. And although this looks like a bee, this is actually a drone fly, which mimics deliberately a honeybee. And this one's actually fitted with a little number tag so that we could study the behavior of individuals pollinating strawberry plants. Another really important group is the blue-banded bees. And these are important because they do a special kind of pollination called buzz pollination. So they grab hold of the plant and then they vibrate their wing muscles really rapidly, and that shakes pollen loose from a kind of pollen container, which is a bit like a salt cellar. And the pollen has to be shaken loose to affect pollination. Honeybees can't do this, and only certain bees can. The most famous ones being bumblebees, which again are not native in Australia. They're established in Tasmania, and we have a project on that. but they're not present in Australia, and they carry similar sort of biosecurity and conservation risks to the honeybees which are already here. So we have focused a lot and continue to focus on stingless bees. These are wonderful native bees. We've got about a dozen species. They're the only native bees that actually live in big colonies. So Amy mentioned that most native bees are solitary and live in the ground. Stingless bees have a lot in common with honeybees. They live in big colonies with a few thousand individuals. This is the inside, the brood comb of the bees. These are the workers, and this larger individual here is actually the queen, who will be laying all of the eggs within this colony. And like honeybees, they visit all sorts of different wild and crop plants. So here they are visiting wild lilies, and they really love the pollen from lilies. And here's one visiting an apple flower. So this has been our main focus, and these are the only native bees that you can keep in a hive, and then you can manage those hives. And this is increasingly popular as a hobby and as a pollination service because they're good pollinators and they're stingless as well, which is pretty handy. So we find that with stingless bees in glasshouses, we get great pollination of a range of plants, and we focus particularly on strawberries. But the problem we've found is that while we get great strawberries, it's not very good for the bees. So the first work we did on this, we found that after about a month of having the hives in the glasshouse, we got lots of great strawberries, but the hives would lose weight and lose activity. And the reason for that is that while they like strawberries, they actually like a really diverse diet. So like us, bees benefit from a diverse diet. And there's work being done with hives outside where you can show they actually feed on small amounts of pollen from lots and lots of different plants. So they don't like being holed up with just one food source. So the next experiment we did, this is work by Sindhu Shiran for her PhD, was to actually grow them and have alongside other floral sort of resource sources that the bees could forage on. And we thought this might help with the health of the bees, but possibly it would trade off with the strawberry production. But what we actually found was that we got a win-win result here. So this little diagram on the right, these are pictures of strawberries from a fairly crappy one on the right, which is unevenly pollinated and has grown in a funny shape, to a nice fat sort of symmetrical ones on the left-hand side. And these are the ones that strawberry growers and strawberry consumers want to eat. And the diagram shows that when we just grew strawberries by themselves, when we just grew a strawberry crop by itself with the stingless bees, we got the bars shown in orange, so a pretty good result, but also some of these less good strawberries on the right-hand side. When we added in the other flowers, although the bees actually diverted some attention to the other flowers, their overall activity and hive health went up, and we ended up with the really high amount of the best strawberries. So if you actually look after the bees, you look after the crops as well. And that's kind of a general principle that we can take from a simple system like the glasshouse back out to the bigger system in the wild and trying to maintain food sources for bees in the landscape and on the farms to help the bees alongside the work they're doing in pollinating the crops. So I'm going to stop there. And Amy has put a QR code to some more information about things she's talked about. With me being a bit more of an old school Gen X type person, I've actually brought some flyers along, like A4 flyers for the people who are here, but also be happy to send those out to people if by email. It's just a single sheet if you're interested. So you may be able to hear we're just beginning to get a big thunderstorm here. So we hope the things will hold up so we can now take some questions. So thanks everybody, and please do send questions in there. Thank you.
Okay, I will start with James as questions. So this is from Carl Ramirez. Should we be helping native pollinators by encouraging termite colonization of trees and or artificially following out dead trees? Carl also just wanted to say that he works as a bush regenerator, so that's where that's coming from.
Thanks, Carl. That's an interesting question. So there does seem to be a correlation for stingless bees specifically between trees which, well, they nest in hollows. So they'll nest in hollows that have been created by different reasons, but one of the main reasons you get a hollowed out tree is termite activity. So certainly in the Northern Territory and in areas in like savanna habitats where there are a lot of termites, they do seem to favor those kind of trees. I don't think generally they need help to have that. I think what's much more important is to conserve those natural areas of vegetation. So if the natural processes are going on in the area, then the bees will have access to that. So probably the greater threat is habitat clearance and habitat conversion. But it's an interesting idea, and there may be specific local contexts where that could be a good thing. But far more of the bees are actually nesting directly in the ground, the other species. But yeah, keeping good habitat is probably the one message you can take everywhere. Thanks.
All right, I'll switch to Amy for the next question. So this one is from Elena. Is there any kind of vegetation brought to Australia that native bees like or can pollinate successfully? And as a comment to that, Eljoan118 said, mangoes, blueberries, and lychees are visited a lot by stingless bees, I think.
Yeah, exactly right. So there are lots of crops that are frequently visited by native bees. On there, James, there's lots. Every time we look at a different crop, really, we find more native bees.
Yes, I mean, yeah, so as those ones mentioned, mangoes, lychees, blueberries, avocados, all of those are visited by native bees. And it's worth, as I mentioned briefly, that native flies also are really quite common. So in some places, avocados are much more visited by native flies than native bees. And I guess generally in the more tropical area, so bees are, a lot of native bees are not very active at lower temperatures. So for example, we find that the stingless bees, 18 degrees centigrade is probably a minimum temperature for stingless bee activity, whereas some flies and the introduced honeybee can be active at quite a lot lower temperatures. So you do see nice patterns like that. And I guess a general one, some of the habitats Amy showed, when you go up to those alpine habitats where it's really cold, the relative importance of flies increases and bees decreases a bit because of the temperatures.
Okay, and just because it's a related question, I'll go with Ivan's question. Would stingless bees have a negative impact on plants with relatively large pollen in comparison to with their small size?
Oh, it's a cool question. I guess, if we're talking about natural abundances of these things in nature, then no, I don't think so. This is just naturally occurring. But if we're talking about managed stingless bees and having multiples in locations where you wouldn't normally see them, then yes, of course, they could have an adverse effect because they can take resources that otherwise would have been available for native pollinators in that natural region. And I guess that is something that, we've got to be particularly aware of when, we are increasing the abundance of bees and moving bees around, even if they are native species, into locations where they, naturally wouldn't have occurred or wouldn't have occurred in such abundance. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. All right, back to Carl. He said that some weed species currently can't sexually reproduce in Australia. Should we be worried that some weeds will start to reproduce sexually if new pollinator species make it to Australia, or if the pollinators already present here adapt to pollinating these weeds?
So again, interesting question. Invasive weeds are a considerable problem for us in many of our ecosystems and also globally. One of the interesting context here is Tasmania, where the Northern Hemisphere bumblebee, Bombus terrestris, has been introduced. And there is a lot of talk about the bumblebees playing a major role in sexual reproduction and spreading of, again, introduced Northern Hemisphere weeds, particularly in sort of paddock areas, and then spreading into more native ecosystems. And we're actually doing some experiments on that at the moment by looking at using exclusions to keep the bumblebees, which are much bigger than any of the native bees and flies, away, and seeing how that impacts the the weed reproduction. So as a PhD student, just starting work on that. In terms of how that plays out on the mainland, then, things, clearly honeybees and stingless bees are very generalist. They'll visit lots of different things. So it's very likely that a lot of invasive weeds are already being pollinated quite happily by both native and introduced species. And then in terms of if we introduce more species, well, that's more introduced bees would be a problem. And there is quite a debate over bumblebees. So there are growers of particularly of tomatoes would like to introduce bumblebees particularly for glasshouse use. But there are real concerns not only over any parasites they might bring that could spread to native bees, but also the fact that, again, they might contribute to weed reproduction. I think it's probably fair to say that although there's a lot of talk, there's not a whole load of data on the relative role of native and introduced bees on the spread of weeds. And certainly it's a really good area for collecting more information.
All right, I'll just read this comment. So Ipan says, great talk, Amy. Inspirational as usual. Thank you, Tanya. Darren says, great talk. Are there impacts on the sugar and nutritional levels of the strawberry in the last slide?
Okay, yes, sugar and nutritional level of strawberry. That's an interesting question. So former PhD student Onyekun Z, who now works actually for Horse Innovation, so has stayed in the horticulture space. He did the first work on stingless bee pollination of strawberries in glass houses, and he compared the sugar and soluble solids content of strawberries that had either been pollinated by stingless bees with different numbers of visits, or hand pollinated by him using a paintbrush, or left to have what's effectively a small amount of wind pollination. So you do get a small amount of pollination of strawberries without insect vectors, but it's usually insufficient. And what that showed was that there was no real difference between hand pollination and stingless bee pollination for the sugar and soluble solids components, but that wasn't a comparison between, for example, honeybees and stingless bees, which you'd probably have to do in an outside situation. So I can't really give you a definitive answer on that, but certainly the stingless bees produced very good strawberries and we were very happy to eat them.
Okay. What is evidence that Varroa is causing decline in feral honeybees? Is this leading to research on impacts of feral honeybees on native flora and fauna?
Thank you, Graham. Yes, at the moment, I'm not aware of anybody that has published a study in Australia on this, but that is the data that Hewan and I have been collecting from very, very preliminary results on the South Coast. I'm seeing declines of up to 95% of honeybees. Indeed, in some areas, I cannot find honeybees where once there was prolific feral populations covering things like Banksia eristofolia. So I think certainly there's more needed in that space, and I'm very open to collaborations in that space, or if anyone was to take on a PhD on those topics. In terms of the plant reproduction, that review paper, that opinion piece that we did, really highlights some of the opportunities in that space. But again, I think there's very few on the ground studies at the moment. I'm aware of a few of Prostanthera densa is one that I'm hoping to get up and running to look at the pollination system of it. But yeah, it's hard. And I think what we really need is people that had data prior to feral honeybees declining. And now we can collect the data after we have potentially seen these declines. So yeah, it's a tricky one, but yeah, watch this space.
I could add to that anecdotally, from our observations on cherry and apple farms in Gilpin and Young, there do seem to be fewer honeybees this season compared with last year. The difficulty is that often the growers respond to a perceived lack of honeybees by going and getting some more hives. So it's quite difficult to separate out the feral honeybees from the ones that have come in with hives. But we are seeing reduced counts in young this year relative to last year. So again, I'm pretty sure it's going on, but there isn't a lot of hard data. And I think it's harder in agroecosystems where growers naturally will respond by trying to take mitigation methods.
I will add to that as well. James is exactly right. It's very much harder in agricultural areas. So one of the things that we were trying to do was actually get away from managed hives. And so what I did was I did a bit of a mapping exercise with all the national parks in New South Wales. And I was trying to get away from locations where, the public could have a managed hive and where the apiary sites are within national parks. And just for context, honeybees can travel up to 13 kilometres. So I had to get within 13, away from any managed hives, from the public, from any borders that, at least 13 kilometres away, and from apiary sites. And in New South Wales, there are no areas that are free from managed hives. So, yeah, it's a very, very, very hard thing to get at when you can't get away from managed hives.
Okay. I have a comment from Roger that says, thank you for the great talks. You say that honeybees fly under the conservation radar, and so they do, but they are not unique in that regard. Think of trout in particular, and even the continued introduction of garden plants and aquarium fishes. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Well, I guess for trout at least, it's it's a sport, right? So I do agree that they do fly under the radar as well, but they're restocking with those. And I think most people, once you explain the problems that can arise from feral honeybees, and I'm not talking just from the perspective of natural systems and the impact they can have there, but they're reservoirs for disease for managed hives as well. So there's multiple avenues and reasons as to why we should be actively removing them or avoiding putting them into natural areas. So I think it's good that we're having these debates about feral species and introduced species in Australia.
Yeah, I have a question from Paul, which I think was related to Graham's question originally about the decline in feral honeybees. Says, how do you monitor the number of each and the estimated counts of pollination? Are you manually counting or using better levels of ML to help count?
Great question. So there's a few different ways. When we're talking about the decline in feral honeybee populations, the best way is actually monitoring and tracking hives over time, because naturally hives will come and go. But if you can map them all within a location and then track them over many, many years, then you can get an understanding of the population demography and how that's tracking over time. A lot of the work on individual species is done by observations in the field. And so once again, these have to be numerous and you have to watch for a very long time to be able to get natural background levels of what normally would be honeybee visits, and then compare that to, potentially declines once Varroas hit that population. So the other aspect to that, which you allude to, is the, actual reproductive output. And that's also tricky because, when we're talking about pollinators, we can't just say, oh, because it visited this flower, it must be a pollinator. There's obviously lots of steps to it being then declared a pollinator. So it needs to be able to transfer and carry the pollen and then initiate fruit set, and it needs to create a fertilized fruit. So in order to understand the contribution of honeybees to fruit set, we do need to follow all those steps all the way through as well. So it is very time consuming and difficult. And I think that's why a lot of the research hasn't been done.
I have a question from Mark. Is anyone looking at how we can breed stingless bees faster? I currently split my hives at around 2 to 3 years, depending on growth.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for that question. And that's actually a topic that we are directly researching at the moment. So feel free to get in touch with us by email to talk more about that. But yes, I mean, the stingless bees are great because they are the one group of native bees that are social. You can keep them in a hive. You can actually do, most of the things you can think of doing with honeybees, you can do with stingless bees from a pollination perspective, but we are not able to propagate them at nearly the same rate. So we are trying to look into that at the moment. So we've done some preliminary work on trying to split hives more than, so the typical way at the moment, as I'm sure you know, is to split a hive in two, or to connect it up to an empty hive box and let it split itself into two, so-called eduction. We are going to be doing some experiments over the next couple of years on trying to split them into more than two, so say a four-way split. We're also looking at providing, trying to increase the success of splits by providing extra things like extra resin sources or food sources for recently split colonies and meeting their nutritional and other requirements. One thing we can't do in stingless bees at the moment is artificially rear queens. It's a big ask, but we are playing around with artificially incubating stingless bees as well and seeing if we can make some progress on that. So absolutely, you've hit the nail on the head that stingless bees have a lot of scope to do some of the things that honeybees do. And a previous question alluded to that as well. But the challenge is to be able to propagate them at a better rate to meet the increasing demand to use them for different cropping situations.
This one is from Elena again. So will native bees become a more dominant pollinator now that we have had the Varroa mite affecting the honeybee? And is there any way to have honeybees and native bees working together in pollinating without taking away resources from each other? I'm hoping to set up a native stingless beehive or a bee hotel for whatever native bees are in the area. Is there anything I should look out for beforehand, such as chemicals often used in gardens?
Great questions. Firstly, I think that's exactly what I'm hoping might happen in terms of if the levels of feral honeybees do decline, potentially that frees up resources that otherwise could have gone to other nectivorous or pollinivorous organisms. And we might see a return back to, the natural state of pollination systems before the introduction of honeybees 200 years ago. And that's one of the big complex questions in pollination ecology, is actually trying to get away from areas where honeybees are. And that's something that we just can't do. So this represents a very real and big opportunity here for us to gauge an understanding of of their impact in those systems. In terms of, having honeybees and native bees side by side and not stealing resources from each other, look, it depends. Something like nectar that's produced by flowers can be in surplus and there can be abundance of it. But the things like pollen, which are often limited, you will see most likely some sort of competition going on. And that's not to say that, that's just interactions between native bees and honeybees. When we actually think of it from the plant's point of view, that pollen is actually, for sexual reproduction. So we're taking that pollen out of that system as well. So if we think about, James' example of thousands and thousands of hives moving into these areas, managed hives, potentially what you're doing is you're taking a lot of the pollen resources that were otherwise available for sexual reproduction for the plants out of that system. And I highly recommend the bee hotels. They're great, and you can even buy observation bee hotels now, so you can see what's actually living inside your bee hotel. Which they're great for your backyard. So, yeah.
So great questions, great engagements from for your audience online. And it's great to see. Our next step is that we will do the recording. We will edit the recording, and in every few days, hopefully it will be released, and we will share with all of you. So thank you for coming online as well as in person. And it was great presentation and great initiative for future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone.